Hey, it's Joe, and welcome to the Automation Guild, where we all get together to help each other with test automation. I'm your host, Joe, from joecollins20.com, testtalks.com, and Guild Conferences, a blog, podcast, and online platform conference dedicated to all things test automation related, where our goal really is to help you succeed in creating test automation awesomeness. And the theme of today's show is in the spirit of Halloween. We're going to go over the 13 test automation practices you should be scared of. So you may be doing some of these practices now, or you may have people in your organization that think that some of these practices are a good idea. Hopefully after the show, you'll realize why you should be scared of them, and you should go away screaming if anyone brings it up. So let's go over the first one here. Now this one's a pretty old school one. It's record and playback. I'm actually not sure how many people actually still do record and playback, but you would be surprised by the amount of people that email me and ask me about record and playback, or that I see in other chats with people in forums when they're talking about test automation, they bring up record and playback. Now, there's also some newer tools that I've been looking at that are free, not open source, but free, like Callion. I'll have it in the show notes, but it's an open source tool that's pretty much just like a vendor-based automation tool like QTP, and it has a record feature where you can do record and playback. Now, record and playback's fine if you're trying to just like explore your application, see what the elements are, and to just mess around and have a throwaway type of script. But if you're going to use it for your full framework, as that's your approach, you're going to do record and playback, you're not going to be very successful. The reason why is the hard code's a lot of information in it. It's like spaghetti code. You don't get reused when you use this approach. And I've never seen it be very successful, especially as you start to scale up. The one thing I have been listening to lately, I've been talking to a lot of vendors, and this might switch because a lot of vendors are talking to me about AI. And with AI and machine learning, when they do record now, you don't even have to know the elements. It picks up the elements and uses all these algorithms to figure out what an element is, where it is. So if it ever changes, it's able to correct itself. So maybe in the future, record and playback may be a viable option. But as of now, I would say that record and playback definitely is not a viable option. You may disagree. If you do, leave a comment. So the second test automation framework or the practice you should be scared of if you're not doing it, is if you're not planning your test automation framework approach before you start coding. So you get all excited and just start coding up your test automation without having a plan in place, what your naming conventions are going to be, where you're going to store your test, how you're going to separate your test, where they're going to live, how often they're going to run, who's responsible for them. It may seem like small stuff or more management type stuff, but I found that if you start working with a larger team, if you don't put that in place from the beginning, this is how we're going to do test automation. Here's the process. Here's the ARC mechanism that we're going to use if something goes wrong. How we're going to plan for failures. Who's going to be responsible for what. This really could put you in a really hard place. So if you try to scale up your testing or your test automation efforts, you think other people are going to be involved in it, you really want to put some thought and effort into it up front before you roll it out, into best practices of what you're going to use and how you envision your test automation to be. Also, if you don't have this in place and you start rolling out to a bunch of different sprint teams, it becomes very difficult to maintain if every single team and every person is approaching it differently. You really need to get ahead of it first. Have a plan in place, roll it out to your teams, explain it, and then every sprint, every time you have code reviews, you look over and you make sure everything's being followed. I think it's very critical, and a lot of times people just want to get into the fun stuff of automating and watching the browser by itself run their tests. But really, if you want not to be scared in the future of your test automation efforts, especially from the maintenance and reliability piece, you want to make sure that you're planning your test frameworks, the best practices. I call this the scaffolding. So you want to make sure you're setting up some scaffolding that you can be used, that you can build around to make sure you have a successful test automation effort overall. So that's the second test automation practice you should be scared of. If you're not doing it, if you're not planning your test automation frameworks, you should be very scared. The third one is not making your test automation maintainable by separating your framework out into layers. So same issue you find with record and playback. You don't want to have spaghetti code. You don't want to have functionality that lives in all your different scripts that if something changes, you need to touch all your scripts. So say you had an element ID, and an element ID was for a login, a username, say. But every single one of your test scripts, so you'd have 1,000 scripts, all had hard-coded in that ID. So if that ID ever changed, you would have to go to all 1,000 scripts and make that change. If you're doing that, you should be very scared, and you should start rethinking your approach here. So for layers, what I'm thinking about is you have a high, what I call like a business layer, which is what we use BDD, so Gherkin. Given I'm a radiologist, when I log into the application, then I should be able to see my studies. There's no code there. It's all English-like syntax. And this word, these language, becomes a descriptive language, or a language that the team all agrees to, that when they say I'm a radiologist, it means the same to you as it to me, as to a real user, as to a PO, so that when anyone's writing a brand new feature, all they need to say is as a radiologist, right? English-like syntax, very easy. Behind that is code that step definitions that actually implement that particular step. So that's another layer for us. I call it a high-level what step, what you want to do. So you have a high-level one, a business-facing step, given I'm a radiologist. And if you click on that, it takes you to a layer in our application, which is more high-level, where is what you want to do. So given I'm a radiologist, I'd like to have just one method that handles something, or just two really high-level methods that are really descriptive, like radiologist.login. That's it, radiologist.login. So once you have your high-level business process facing, you have what I call it almost like a business-facing code layer. It's not really code, so I don't have any if statements there. It's really high-level abstracts, methods, and functions I've created. And that's just so if you have a lot of team members that don't really know how to code, if you have that business-facing defined already, and you have a library of given when then statements that everyone uses, and they all call this first what step layer. When someone looks to that what step, they're not all of a sudden looking at a bunch of code switch statements and they have no idea what's happening. So that's how I like to separate it. And then what happens, I have a what step. I should have a visual for this, but I don't. Maybe I'll post it in the show notes at automationguild.com/show. But just imagine for a second with me, you have the business layer step. That calls what I'm calling a what step. And then, so what steps should be really high level, and what steps call what I call how steps. And how steps really are the more code-like level things, where it's not what someone wants to do, but how they want to do it. So this has all the information about clicks, edits, types, all those types of things. And then those then call even lower level things called page objects, which most of you probably know about. And that's where we have our element IDs defined and common methods that people use over and over again. We also have utility libraries. So we have different folks working on different layers. So over time, when we first started, we didn't have many layers or many high-level abstract methods. So it was mostly developers creating this. Now over time, since we built up a library of all the functionality people can do in a descriptive way, the developers don't have to write as much code, and now people that don't really write code can go in and have this nice high-level abstract layer that they can interface with to create test automation without having to worry about code. When they do come across functionality that hasn't been coded yet, then the developers would jump in. But that's how I separate, and that's what I mean by not having your tests separate out into layers. I just find, from my experience, having layers that take care of specific things. So if something goes wrong, you only need to go to one place to make that change, the better off you're going to be. If you just have, spaghetti code and just you don't know where anything's going, I find it very hard to maintain. So that's one tip I would think you should try if you want to be less afraid of your tests for maintenance and changing them. So the next one, number 4, is you should be very scared of if you finally do get automation. Your manager goes, thou shall have automation, and your team's like, okay, yeah, we have to do automation. But then it just becomes a checkbox on the definition of done of, yes, we did automation. Is the story done? Yes, we did automation, right? Whatever, yeah, automation done. But when you look at what they've done, it's just really bad code. It's not really testing what you think it should be testing. And it's all just because they want to close that story, move on with their lives, and say that it's all set to go. So if your teams are doing this, you're going to have a really hard time, especially as you move towards continuous integration, continuous delivery. You need to be able to have run these tests reliably, in a reliable manner, not have them be flaky. And if your teams are just treating it as just like a checkbox, yeah, we did it, most likely they're not putting a lot of thought and effort into making these tests maintainable. And when they do go into your continuous integration environment, when they do fail, the teams are going to start saying, well, automation, it's a waste of time. Well, it's really not a waste of time. It's just because the team has not invested time in it. So this is something I actually just real world experience, but I went through. Kind of funny. Well, we'll go over it on the next step, but stay tuned to what the story is. But I have a real world example of how this comes into play that I'll wrap up to give you a real world example of what I go through and what I've seen that I think will help you if you haven't experienced this yet. But definitely number 4, make sure you don't treat your test automation as just a definition of done as a checkbox. I don't know why this isn't a larger text, but I have to fix that. Another thing that I've seen as a hurdle is all right, maybe it's getting old with the sound effects, but I think it's fun. But anyway, if you plan on using continuous integration and continuous delivery, you should be getting involved in it as soon as possible. So if you just starting a test automation effort, or you have a few tests already and you plan on going to CI/CD, but you're thinking, no, I'm just going to write all my test suite, all my regression tests first, and then I'm going to port them over and then run them in CI/CD. Be very, very afraid. And the reason why I say this is I know of a specific team where I work for where I told them they had consultants contractors, they were going to create their BDD for them, right? And then they would accept them. I told them they should not accept these tests until they actually took the test from the contractor, the consultant, and ran it in a CI/CD environment for a week and make sure that they ran reliably without any issues, right? Of course, did they listen to me? No, right? So what do you think happened? People started freaking out about a year later after they had thousands of automated tests, and they realized these don't run in our CI/CD environment. And so they had to take a lot of time to refit these things, change some architecture to get them to work. Really a big headache. So if you plan on using CI/CD, don't treat it as an afterthought. I really think that automation and CI are merging. These are a discipline that's becoming one, and that you as a test automation engineer also need to be a CI/CD expert. That's my personal opinion. I just see that eventually these two the things are going to merge and lines are going to blur. So get on top of it now if you're not already, but you definitely want to be thinking of your CI/CD. Also, what I've noticed is teams need to be responsible for the results. So if tests start failing, if your teams aren't paying attention to them, what's the point of having all these tests, right? If no one's paying attention to them, I would just delete them. I heard Facebook deletes things after, I think, 48 hours. If you have a test that's failing in CI/CD and your team's notified and no one fixes it within 48 hours, I don't know if the time's right or I'm making this up. I could swear I heard this story. They will delete the test because obviously they think it must not be an important test, right? And if it's not an important test, why run it? Why have the overhead? So that's probably another point here. But anyway, if you plan on running in CI/CD, make sure you plan from the beginning and start integrating it and figuring out your pipelines and how things are going to run. Take your automation through the full life cycle, the process from beginning to end with CI/CD, and make sure that everything's sound and makes sense. The next practice you should be scared of is when people boast, oh, we have thousands of automation tests, thousands of UI tests. Look how great we are. We have, and you look at it, the results, and everything's failing. Or what's even more scary is if they're all passing, right? I guess you can't win, because if everything's passing, sometimes you wonder, well, are these passing because they really aren't doing anything, or are they passing because they really are doing something and they're doing a good job? But in general, if people say we have thousands of UI tests, you probably have an issue there. I think even Simon, the creator of Selenium 2, brought this up a few years ago at Selenium Conf. then when he hears someone saying they have thousands of Selenium tests, he gets worried because that's not the point. I mean, you should only automate UI tests when they need to be automated at the UI level. And having your whole test focused on UI-based testing and you have thousands of UI tests, I would be worried. Also, the reason why it's kind of scary is over time, your tests are just going to get more and more. And if you're never going back and looking after a sprint or after a release saying, okay, here's our test suite as it is now. Do we still need these tests? Are these tests still adding value? I think a lot of teams don't do this. And so you end up having a very large code base of tests that you have to maintain, you have to make reliable, yet no one necessarily knows what they're doing. They're not necessarily adding value. So when they fail, people don't really care because they don't know what it's really doing. So it doesn't matter how many tests you have. I'd rather have 5 or 10 hardcore UI tests that really focused on risk areas of my application, that when they fail, people were like, oh my God, they failed. It's a real bug. They paid attention to it. Then having thousands of automated tests that test every part of my application, but they're flaky. No one pays attention to them. So if you have thousands and thousands of UI-based test automation frameworks, you should be scared and you should avoid that in the future. Number 7 is sorry, I'm easily amused. But number 7 is ignoring results. This is pretty much what the past 2 points I brought up. And ignoring results, you should be very scared. This is what happens with the previous steps we've done when people start not paying attention to your automated tests because they say, oh, they're not reliable. And the reason why they're not reliable is because they didn't listen to you from the beginning of how you should set up your test, how they should be a framework, how all these points. And when they start failing in CI, people just ignore them. Or, they're like, oh, we'll fix it the next sprint. We'll fix it the next sprint. We'll add it as tech debt, right? Man, if that happens, you should be very scared because the whole point of creating tests is to get feedback. And when you get feedback, it should be valuable feedback. So tests should not just be because, oh, let's create some automated tests. You should be creating tests for a specific purpose that gives you a specific result that if it fails, it should help your developers. It should act like a safety net, that they should feel like they should be able to refactor things, they should be able to check in code and be able to know whether or not they broke something, right? If they don't have that, if people are ignoring your results, you should be really afraid and scared because you're going to end up maintaining a bunch of tests that no one cares about. And in the end, it's just going to be a lost cause. So if your team is ignoring results, you should be very scared and you should be running right now. All right, number 8 is like I said, I've covered some of these in the past, but I thought I'd combine all of them for the top 13. And so record and playback really isn't used much, but I thought 13 was a much scarier number than 12. But number 8 is falling in love with a tool. Now, I know I don't know if Greg's still here in the chat or not, but old-time automation engineers like myself, I'm not saying Greg's old, I'm just saying we have been around for a little bit longer than probably some folks that started with Selenium. And we probably started off with tools like WinRunner, right? Or Silk Test. And we loved those tools. Those tools did everything we wanted. We could manipulate them. We could make them do anything. What happens, though, and the old saying is if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is when you fall in love with a tool, you start saying, we can do this with this tool. It may not even be the right tool to use. It may not be the optimal thing to do. But because you're so familiar with it, right? And because you know it, that's the tool you're going to choose. And it's not necessarily always the best one to use for your business. So always use a tool that makes sense for what you're trying to do. I know it's hard. I do the same thing. Like, why don't we just use, Selenium with Java, right? But it may not make sense for this project. Maybe you need to do performance testing, and it may make sense to use a performance tool, right? And not force a functional tool to do something it wasn't meant to do. A lot of times people do that. Or for visual validation testing. There are tools that can do better visual validation than a functional test tool like QTP, right? So use the right tool for what you want. Don't fall in love with tools because I swear I really loved WinRunner. I wish I still had the email with me, but I remember asking when QTP first came out, I said, what's going to happen to WinRunner? And they said, oh, Joe, don't worry. WinRunner is going to be around forever. Our user base is so large. And don't worry. So I was like, okay, cool, right? So I didn't bother getting up to speed with QTP. And guess what happened, right? 6 months later, Windrunner is dead. Never heard of it again. And so I had to get up to speed really quick with QTP. So don't fall in love with tools. If you fall in love with tools, you should be very scared. So that's number 8. Number 9 is... all your automated tests are UI tests. Did I already cover this one? No. What I covered before was you have thousands of UI tests, so thousands of automated tests. What's scarier is number 9 is when not only do you have thousands of UI tests, but your only automated test, your only plan you have for automation or testing is UI-based test. If you do, man, it's a scary thing. You don't want to be in this situation. And a lot of times, like I've been in code reviews where we use BDD, right? And I'm in there with developers, and they're like, "Well, we do a retrospective. Why did this bug go into production? Why was this found?" And they're like, "Well, the BDD test was flaky." Oh yeah, what was the error? What were you trying to capture? Oh, it's an array error. Okay, well, you probably should be using something called a unit test, right, for those types of things, right? So use the right test for the right layer, what you're trying to do. I would always say, do you have a unit test for this? No? Can there be a unit test for it? If so, write a unit test. Then go no further, right? Make sure it's covered at the unit level. If your unit test can't perform the action or verify what you're trying to do, try to do like an API type test or integration test. Can it be done at API level? No. Or yes, then write an API test, .no more. Or can it be, but you haven't done it yet? If so, write an API test. But if you can't do an API test, then only then go to the UI level. And so that's how I approach it. Like I said, this might change in the future. I've been speaking to a lot of different vendors now with AI and machine learning, and I'm getting kind of excited and kind of scared. It's probably a lot of false assumptions because I haven't tried these tools yet, but this might change. But as of now, and probably in the future, I would stick with this approach of having more unit tests, because also you need feedback for your developers, especially if you're using CI/CD. The quicker you can get that feedback to your developers, did you check in code? Did it break? Yes. Fix it. The longer you take to create that loop, it's harder it's going to be for them to get back and say, okay, what did I check in? What did I do that broke this? So you want to get that fast feedback. Quickest way to get the fastest feedback is to have unit tests really fast, really small. Same thing with API tests, tend to run faster. And even UI tests, if you're going to do UI tests, I would write small, focused UI, atomic UI tests, right? So if it fails, you know why it fails. Not like these end-to-end monster workflows where you're like, I checked in a patient, I added a procedure to them, and then they checked out, and then we did if that's your whole workflow, maybe you have a few of those, but if every single unit test is like that, or every single UI test is like that, man, when something fails, you'll have no idea why it failed. It takes you hours to troubleshoot. So be very afraid if your whole, I can't think of the word, but your whole strategy for test automation is just, we're going to have all automated UI tests, right? I mean, sounds great at first. Maybe if you have 10 UI tests and you start off that way, but sprint after sprint after sprint, that's all you have, you should be very afraid. So I'll be looking at comments shortly. Right now, I see the comments, but they're on my Mac. They're too far away. Can't get the app working here, but I'll be looking at them in a few seconds. So the 10th, or the 10 things, or the 10th one you should be afraid of. And hopefully, as we all get together and share these practices, maybe that's just my organization. Maybe I'm just in a really dysfunctional place, right? That people are just out of their minds. But I don't think so, because like I said, I talk to a lot of people on my podcast, Test Talks, and there's a lot of insane people out there. So, automate everything. I love test automation, right? Automation Guild. I'm about automation, right? My motto is automation awesomeness. I love automation. Of course I would love to automate everything, but not everything could, should, or gives you any value to automate. So it's really important that if someone is telling you to automate everything, that you go, wait a minute. Even if everything was automated, I've spoken to people that everything was automated, right? They went to market, no one bought their application. Why? Because no one's talking to the user, say, would you really want this? So you really want to make sure when you automate something, it's adding value. Matt Heuser talks a lot about risk-based automation. Dave Hefner has different categories in his book on areas of automation that you should focus on based on your business. Even what might be right for me, I work for a healthcare, so we might have some extra rigor. May not be the same for you. Your startup may not have to have those same rigors. So you really just automate things that give you value. Really, the things that I see give most value with testing is exploratory testing. Bar none, exploratory testing, in my experience, has found the most bugs, the most issues that I've ever seen. I've never seen someone create thousands of automated tests, run them, right? Not pay attention to them ever again, and say, you know what? Wow, that gave us a lot of value, right? Yes, it's very important. Test automation is important. Automation in general is important. Anything you could do to automate something to make the software development lifecycle quicker, faster, easier for your developers, I would say yes. But not everything should be automated, not everything could be automated, and not everything makes sense to be automated. So make sure you're always making sure, are we automating this for the right reasons? If not, then carry on. All right, number 11 is, this drives me nuts, and I'm very tempted to do this a lot of times, is rewriting your framework, right? And once again, I probably mentioned this before. I've had someone that says, all right, we have a UFT framework, and it's buggy. It's failing, it's unreliable. We're going to rewrite everything in Selenium, right? That's going to solve everything, right? Selenium's going to solve it. And so they go off and they write the same exact tests in Selenium, right? And then a year later, they're like, you know what? Selenium's not reliable. Nothing's reliable. Nothing's working. We need a new framework. We're going to use Protractor, right? Yeah, Protractor is what we need. We're going to rewrite our whole framework. And they take a year, they rewrite it. It's very intoxicating. It's great to learn new frameworks and do that. And it's very tempting when you're in a room with your manager and they're like, well, what do you think we should do? And you being the expert go, we should rewrite our framework. I think this is an easy way out. And a lot of times people leave companies so that they say rewrite the framework. They get all the experience of using that framework and they leave before people realize that it's a pile of unreliable, flaky tests just like it's always been. So what I would say is stick with the framework you have and try fixing it, right? This rewriting your framework is just if you like it is like gonzo garbage. But even then, you probably have tests, you probably have things in place. I would try rewriting, reworking the framework you have to make it more reliable. I think they would give the biggest bang for your buck. Real world example, real world, right? I've been talking to this group for years that when something fails in CI/CD, they need to take responsibility. The team owns it. They need to fix it. So they would complain, our framework's not reliable. We need to rewrite it. We need a new tool. Have you looked at this? And I'm like, no, you just need to fix your test. And so we'd have 72, 100 errors every night for our nightly runs. And finally, I got management to say, okay, sprint teams, you need to pay attention to when these tests fail and fix them. If they're flaky, fix them. Guess what happened? Right? I didn't rewrite any code. I didn't create a new framework. I didn't do anything. They started paying attention to the test. They started to fix them. Our nightly results now is 1, 2 failures. That's it. It's crazy, right? And they think, oh, what did you do? What magic did we, what money did we invest in it? Nothing. You just paid attention to the test, right? So really, don't. I know it's tempted, right? But I'd be very scared if your manager tells you, let's rewrite the framework. I would go, hold up, right? All right, number 12, and I know we're getting late. I'm a little over time. No code reviews, right? Not treating your automation code like code. Really, test automation is just like any other software development process. It needs the same process, the same rigors, the same things you do for any type of software artifact. It's the same thing you do for your automated tests. You need to do code reviews. You need to have them in source control. Treat them just like any other valuable asset. They are. If they're not, then what's the point? It is real code. They need to be treated just like code because they need to be maintained. Just writing a test is not going to live by itself forever. You need to tell management what it means when you say automate something, that it's not just one and done. It's a real software development life cycle. Just when you develop software, you don't just forget about it and never go back to it. You're always refactoring, always making it better, always having rigor around it. Same thing with test automation. And number 13, Number 13, I think, is the scariest of them all, and that is you just totally lose sight of why you're doing this at all. And you just, I'm an automation engineer. Let's automate. Yeah, I'm like that. I admit. I love it. But once you start losing sight of why you're even doing this, the whole point is to make sure you're delivering quality products to your customers that they're going to love, that they're going to rebuy, they're going to tell all their friends about, so that people buy your product and keep you employed, right? If you lose focus of that, you're not thinking about the end user and you're just thinking about automation, let's automate something, and not thinking why you're automating it. Is there any risk involved? Is it adding any value? Then you should be bonkers scared. You should go running. You should start screaming and notifying everyone that to run for their lives, because that is the main point of anything to do with testing, right? That's our jobs as testers, is to make sure, the whole team is creating quality products from beginning to end, and that we're not just doing something just to do it, just to learn a new tool or technique, that we really are focusing on the end users. All right, so those are the top 13 test automation practices you should be scared of if you're following them. Tell me what you think. Leave a comment. If you like this episode, why not subscribe to my YouTube channel or give me a thumbs up, right? I can't stand. Sometimes people just give a thumbs down. I don't know why. This is free stuff. And if you like this, make sure to check out the Automation Guild, automationguild.com. It's the first ever online conference dedicated 100% to test automation. It's going to be the second annual test automation conference going on the week of January 8th to the 10th. We're going to have 20 plus of the top experts in the world on test automation joining us to share a tip, tool, technique, and best practice that's going to help accelerate your test automation efforts in 2018. If that sounds good to you, head on over to automationguild.com and register now. And like I said, if you like this episode, subscribe or give me a thumbs up or like it down below. I really appreciate it. I will edit this and upload it to automationguild.com/show. And if I didn't get to something, I know Greg's in here. Sorry, Greg, I didn't get to your piece because I ran out of time. I always think I can't talk. I'm very introverted, and my wife thinks, when we go out, I hardly say a word, but I actually took up more than a half hour. So hopefully you got value out of that. I can't look at the chat. I need to work on my process here for some reason. YouTube chat, I have this set up just so I could see it. I can't see it. I see it on my Mac right here, but it's too small. I'm going to jump over there, answer any questions you might have. But thanks for joining the Automation Guild. I'm Joe, and my mission is to help you succeed with creating automation awesomeness. As always, test everything and keep the good. See you next time. We're changing the show to Thursdays rather than Fridays, because Fridays I usually take off. Like, that's what happened last week. I apologize for last week. That's a whole nother story. But as always, test everything and keep the good. See you next week at Thursday at 12 for the next Automation Guild show. Cheers.